Few women have held the world in their thrall quite like Lillie Langtry. She was not born to privilege. She had no title, no fortune, no powerful connections. And yet, when she entered a room, the air itself seemed to shift. With nothing but her beauty, her wit, and an uncanny ability to command attention, she bent society to her will. Artists immortalized her, aristocrats worshipped her, and kings broke the rules of power just to be near her. Oscar Wilde called her the finest mind he had ever met. A smitten Texas judge claimed to name a town after her, and the future King of England? He made her his first official mistress, plunging them both into scandal, trial, and public censure. And then there was the prince, the one who gave her a secret she would take to her grave. But Lillie Langtry was not just a mistress, a muse, or a scandalous beauty. She was a force of nature. She reinvented the way stars were received, walking the first red carpet before Hollywood even existed. She turned fame into fortune, pioneering the first celebrity endorsements. She built her own theater, outshone the great actresses of her time, and even carved her name into the world of winemaking. An empire built not on inheritance, but on unrelenting will. Yet for every triumph, there was a price. She carried on affairs with dukes, lords, kings, and princes, setting high society ablaze with whispers. But one affair became her greatest secret. A daughter, born in shadows, raised as a niece. The deception carved a rift that would never heal. She married young, to a man who refused to release her. When he died in an asylum under mysterious circumstances, rumors clung to her name like smoke. And when she married into aristocracy just months later, the whispers only grew louder. But in the end, who was she? A mere courtesan? A self-made legend who defied the world and rewrote the rules of power? A mother who sacrificed her own flesh and blood for a chance at immortality? Or a woman who rose too high, too fast, only to pay the ultimate price? This is not just the story of a scandal. This is the story of power, of passion, of a woman who refused to be forgotten. This is the full, uncensored biography of Lillie Langtry. If you like stories like this, please consider subscribing or giving us a like. We have over 70 women's biographies on the channel, and your support really makes a difference. Now, let's get into the rise and fall of Lillie Langtry. Born Emily Charlotte Le Breton on October 13, 1853, in the ivy-clad old Rectory of St. Saviour, Jersey, she entered a world of quiet privilege. Her father, the Very Reverend William Corbett Le Breton, was the island's formidable dean, a man she would later describe as widely adored for his geniality and charm of disposition. Her mother, Amelie Davis Martin, was a delicate beauty, poetic, musical, and possessed of a quiet, wistful air. The Le Bretons cut a striking figure. The dean, towering over 6 feet, had eyes as sharp and blue as the sea, a mane of prematurely white hair, and the bearing of a soldier rather than a clergyman. By contrast, Mrs. Le Breton was a wisp of a woman, fragile yet luminous. Charles Kingsley, who had known her as a girl in Chelsea, called her the most bewitchingly beautiful creature he had ever seen. Together, they had 7 children, 6 sons, and at the heart of them all, Lillie, the lone daughter in a household of men. Their home, wrapped in climbing roses and sweet-scented jasmine, stood as a sanctuary of Victorian domesticity. But beneath its fragrant facade, scandal brewed. Like many a vicarage of the age, the deanery harbored its own sins. In her carefully worded memoirs, Lillie painted her father as a man of warmth and charm, but years later, she would be more candid. He couldn't be trusted with any woman anywhere, she wrote. Dean Le Breton was, in the euphemistic phrasing of the time, a ladies' man. His indiscretions ranged from whispered liaisons to outright scandal. One tale tells of the dean emerging from church with a beauty on each arm, only to be set upon by their enraged husbands. A man well-practiced in evasion, he simply melted into the crowd, leaving the gentlemen to thrash at one another, their walking sticks raised like sabers. But not all his escapades were the stuff of light-hearted gossip. Jersey teemed with darker rumors, of housemaids and flower sellers too afraid to refuse the advances of the muscular man of God. Some claimed his distinctive features appeared again and again among the island's children. Even the local postman, years later, bore an uncanny resemblance to the long-dead dean. His wife, embodying the silent endurance expected of Victorian women, took to her bed, plagued by mysterious ailments. She outlived her husband by decades, speaking of him only in hushed, reverent tones. "My dear husband, the dean," she would murmur, as though invoking a saint. For Lillie, the revelation of her father's indiscretions did not come as idle gossip, but as a wound. At 16, she had fallen hopelessly in love with a local boy, handsome, slightly younger, and by society's measure, beneath her. When her father commanded her to end the romance, she refused. Only then did he reveal the truth. The boy was his son. The words struck like a blow, knocking the breath from her lungs. For a moment, the world seemed to tilt, the walls pressing inward. She had adored her father, worshipped him to the extent of a fixation. Now, in one brutal instant, the foundation of her childhood crumbled. She lost not only her first love, but the illusion of her father's virtue. Yet even before this reckoning, Lillie had never fit the mold of a Victorian miss. Raised among 6 brothers, she was neither sheltered nor subdued. "I must steady my nerves, control my tears, and look at things from a boy's point of view," she would later say. As she grew, Lillie became an incorrigible tomboy, a spirit of wild freedom amidst the pastoral beauty of Jersey. She could climb trees with the agility of a squirrel, vault fences with the grace of a wild colt, and match the boys in their enthusiasm for mischief. The tree-shaded churchyard of St. Saviour's became their kingdom, a place where innocence and rebellion blurred. In the dead of night, Lillie and her youngest brother would sneak out of bed, hearts pounding with the thrill of forbidden adventure. Draped in sheets and mounted on stilts, they haunted the graveyard like mischievous spirits, unsettling any late-night passers-by. Their ghostly antics continued until a stern letter appeared in the local Jersey paper, warning that the restless spirits would be met with a blast of buckshot. Their thirst for mischief was insatiable. Door knockers, those proud sentinels of the parish's stately homes, fell prey to their marauding hands. Braving snarling dogs and the wrath of enraged householders, they claimed their trophies with a daring that both delighted and exasperated their neighbors. Yet of her 6 brothers, only 2, William and Clement, would survive. The others were tragically claimed by accident or disease. The weight of memory rested on her shoulders. The laughter that once echoed through their home, now replaced by a silence as vast and profound as the sea that surrounded their island. But beneath her wild streak lay a contemplative side, one that found solace in the quiet company of books. Her father, for all his failings, was a man of progressive ideals. He believed women should be as well educated as men. Under his guidance, she studied Shakespeare, Latin, history, and mathematics. Her mother, the gentle duchess of their home, nurtured in her a love of poetry and nature. Together, they found joy in the wildflowers that carpeted the island, the birdsong that filled the air, and the ever-changing sea that cradled their world. At 14, she received her first marriage proposal. Lord Suffield, a distinguished visitor to Jersey, once told her, "Do you know, Miss Le Breton, that you are very, very beautiful? You ought to have a season in London," but when she did, it was a disaster. At 16, Lillie and her mother arrived in London, hopeful and eager. The world they entered was one of polished manners, measured words, and practiced charm, an art she had never been taught. At a grand ball hosted by Lord and Lady Suffield, she stepped into a glittering world of silks, diamonds, and whispered conversations. From the first moment, she felt utterly out of place, but humiliation was never enough to crush Lillie Langtry. Back in Jersey, she set about transforming herself. She read voraciously, absorbed poetry, and studied the art of conversation. Between the ages of 16 and 20, she reflected, I learned the magic of words, the beauty and excitement of poetic imagery. I learned there was something in life other than horses, the sea, and the long Jersey tides. Beneath her lyrical reflections lay a pragmatic yearning for London, for society, for escape. I was possessed by a conviction that my destiny lay in London, she would later write, her words tinged with the quiet urgency of a caged bird. And in a world where a woman's fate so often hinged upon matrimony, Lillie understood that marriage was the vessel that might carry her to the broader stage she craved. But suitors of consequence were scarce in the damp, provincial air of the Channel Islands. Lillie was 20 before she encountered a man who seemed to offer even the faintest promise of more. Edward Langtry was not, by any measure, the gleaming knight of a schoolgirl's imaginings. A widower at 26, he cut an unremarkable figure. Plump, phlegmatic, his expression perpetually resigned beneath a drooping mustache. His passions began and ended with sailing and fishing. His lineage, though respectable, bore no trace of nobility. His father and grandfather were Belfast ship owners, men of trade rather than title. Yet in Edward, Lillie saw possibility. He had attended Oxford, or so he claimed, and dabbled in law. He owned a house in England. Most enticingly, he appeared wealthy. His yacht, the Red Gauntlet, anchored off St. Helier, glittered like a promise. One day there came into the harbor a most beautiful yacht, Lillie later recalled with a wry smile. I met the owner and fell in love with the yacht. To become the mistress of the yacht, I married the owner with the reluctant blessing of her parents, who both believed, perhaps rightly, that she could have done better. Lillie married Edward Langtry on March 9, 1874, in St. Saviour's Church, her father presiding over the ceremony. Instead of glittering ballrooms and soirees, Lillie found herself adrift, sometimes quite literally, on Edward's yachts or marooned at Cliff Lodge, their home overlooking Southampton Water. He was poorer than she had imagined, duller than she had feared, and to her dismay, not as easily managed as she had assumed. While she struggled to navigate the unfamiliar rhythms of household management, Edward frittered away his days in idle chatter with his yachting companions. We had so little to say that breakfast became a solitary ritual. 2 trays, 2 rooms, 2 strangers. It was hardly unusual. Victorian wives were not expected to find pleasure in the marriage bed, nor were their husbands expected to provide it. Brides were often led to the altar in a state of near total ignorance, their mother's only instruction being not to deny their husbands their rights. Lillie's disappointment was not unique, but for a woman of her vibrancy, it was a quiet devastation. Yet the deeper wound was not found in the hushed silences of their marriage, but in the cold reality of social exclusion. Despite her new name, the Red Gauntlet and Cliff Lodge, she remained a provincial outsider. She had escaped Jersey, but London's gilded doors remained firmly shut. In late 1875, illness struck. Lillie fell dangerously ill with typhoid fever, a sickness that drained the color from her world and left her wading through the slow delirium of convalescence. Her attending physician, believing a change of air might hasten her recovery, suggested she leave Southampton for a time. And so, with a curious lack of subtlety, Lillie proposed London. "I have no idea," she later wrote with mock innocence, "what led us to select the great, smoky city as a sanatorium." By early 1876, the Langtrys took up residence in Eaton Place. Lillie filled her days wandering through museums, strolling through pleasure gardens, and haunting Hyde Park, where she lingered at the edges of grand processions, hoping to glimpse a royal figure. "I had never set eyes on even a minor one," she later admitted. A year would pass before fortune twisted the key. A chance encounter with Lord Ranelagh, an old acquaintance from Jersey, led to an invitation, one that would alter the course of her life. Lady Seabright's At Home, a modest gathering, perhaps by London standards, but for Lillie, it was a portal. "It was this invitation," she later declared, "that completely changed the current of my life." In the months following Lady Seabright's party, Lillie Langtry became a sensation. The quiet girl from Jersey, who had once felt so out of place in London's glittering ballrooms, now moved through them with effortless grace. She ascended swiftly from the intimate salons of artistic patrons to the grandest drawing rooms of Mayfair and Belgravia. "There was scarcely a great house in London that I did not visit during my first season," she later wrote, with a trace of astonishment still woven into her words. She had arrived at a rare and opportune moment, when the rigid edifice of English society was beginning to loosen at its seams. By the late 1870s, the aristocracy, once a fortress of unyielding tradition, was yielding, however reluctantly, to the changing tides of wealth and influence. For centuries, the English upper class had been a tight-knit caste, bound by bloodlines stretching back through 1,500 families, their power entrenched in ancient titles and vast acres of land. But now, wealth, not birth, had become the true passport to social acceptance. American railroad heiresses and Johannesburg mining magnates' daughters married into England's grandest families, their dowries restoring crumbling mansions and resurrecting bankrupt estates. For Lillie, this quiet revolution presented an opportunity, one she seized with both hands. She was neither brash nor gaudy. By Victorian standards, she was a lady. Her husband, Edward Langtry, though disappointing in many respects, did not soil his hands with trade. His grandfather may have been a shipowner, but Edward was, by the standards of the time, a gentleman of leisure. Lillie's own pedigree, too, was respectable. As the daughter of the Dean of Jersey, she occupied a niche just below the landed gentry. Clergymen's daughters, while not aristocratic, were undeniably genteel. Moreover, her family had ties to the peerage. Yet it was not lineage that made Lillie a phenomenon. It was something more elusive, a quiet magnetism, a beauty that seemed illuminated from within. She was vivacious yet refined, sensual yet never coarse. Those who observed her in those early days noted a trace of shyness, a gentle contrast to the brazen social climbers who prowled London's drawing rooms. But if beauty and breeding could open doors, wealth was the key to staying in. And here, Lillie's fortunes faltered. Edward Langtry was not nearly as rich as she had once imagined. Like so many families of his kind, the Langtrys had ridden the swift arc from rags to riches and back again within 3 generations. Edward had no head for finance. In his efforts to keep pace with the yachting set, the millionaire sportsmen who raced 300-ton cutters, he had squandered much of his inheritance. Lillie, like many Victorian wives, had been kept in the dark about their finances. But it did not take a banker to recognize the signs of dwindling wealth. They owned no grand country house, no town mansion, not even a carriage. She had entered society on foot, and society had noticed. And yet, what Lillie lacked in fortune, she possessed in something far rarer. She had become, in the breathless parlance of the day, a curiosity. The city hummed with talk of the Jersey beauty, with her golden hair and porcelain skin. She was, quite suddenly, the most sought-after woman in London. 2 of the most celebrated artists of the age, John Everett Millais and Frank Miles, recognized in her not just beauty, but an almost indefinable presence. Miles, a prolific sketch artist whose portraits of fashionable women adorned countless drawing rooms, captured Lillie first. His pencil traced the delicate arch of her brow, the curve of her lips, the soft luminescence of her skin. Within days, he completed another sketch, sold it to a printer, and watched as it was replicated in its thousands. Soon, Lillie's ethereal visage peered from shop windows across London. "My sketches of Lillie during her first London season," Miles would later write, "earned far more than I've ever made on the largest commissions for my most expensive paintings." Her next brush with fame came through Millais himself. He selected Lillie as the model for Effie Deans, the tragic heroine of Sir Walter Scott's The Heart of Midlothian. When the painting was exhibited at the Marsden Galleries in King Street, it became a sensation. Millais had not merely captured a likeness, he had created a story. The painting's sentimental charm resonated deeply with its Victorian audience soon. But it was his next portrait that would immortalize her. "She was the most exasperating subject I have ever painted," he later confessed. "For 50 minutes of each hour, she looked only beautiful, but for the other 10, she looked amazing." When the painting was exhibited at the Royal Academy in 1878, it bore a deceptively simple title, A Jersey Lily. Her fame deepened as photography, still a young and enchanting art, captured her likeness. The Victorian age was at its height, and with it, an insatiable appetite for beauty. Soon her face was everywhere, from drawing rooms to shop windows to postcards. In just a year, her likeness had become as familiar as the Queen's, and all London photographers sought her out. The Jersey Lily had stepped into legend. She became a fixture in London's most exclusive circles. Invitations arrived in an endless stream. For Lillie, these were nights of transformation, where the quiet girl from Jersey became the Jersey Lily, an enchantress among England's elite. Her breathless recollections of that season shimmer with titles and names, each one a rung on the ladder of acceptance. The Duchess of Westminster invited her to the country. Lady Rosslyn offered her a seat in her carriage for a drive through the park. Lord Hartington, besotted, ruined his evening attire by wading into a marble pool, plucking water lilies to lay at her feet. Yet in every gilded room, trailing a step behind, stood Edward Langtry, her husband, her shadow. A married woman could not be invited alone, of course. Society demanded the appearance of propriety, even as it whispered behind painted fans. "My husband greatly disliked all this publicity," Lillie recorded with a cool detachment, sometimes losing his temper and blaming me. Yet Edward never refused to accompany her. Whether from loyalty, resignation, or sheer inertia, he stood beside her, adrift, unmoored in a world that was no longer his own. "He felt quite like a fish out of water," she remarked. A simple observation, but one that cut with the sharpness of truth. Through this kaleidoscope of parties, Lillie remained a vision of elegance, always in the same dress. The black gown she had worn to Lady Seabright's party had become her uniform, a banner of both necessity and mourning. Lord Randolph Churchill, writing to his wife Jenny, captured the murmurs of society. "I dined with Lord Warncliffe last night and took in to dinner a Mrs. Langtry, a most beautiful creature, quite unknown, very poor, and they say has but one black dress." It was not merely poverty that kept Lillie in black. In December 1876, her younger brother Reggie had died in a riding accident in Jersey. Victorian mourning required not only grief, but its outward display. A shadow that clung to her, a black thread woven through the white-gloved tapestry of London's society. For months, the black gown was her armor. Only when Lady Dudley, with the gentlest of nudges, suggested a change, did Lillie finally shed her mourning. The effect was nothing short of revelatory. The dress, a masterpiece of restraint, was a creation of white velvet embroidered with pearls. Its bodice, low-cut and close-fitting, clung to her frame, while the skirt, drawn back into a bustle, accentuated the length of her legs, the seductive curve of her hips. Looking back, Lillie later recalled, and judging from the sensation it caused, it must have been a striking creation. "As I entered the ballroom, the dancers stopped and crowded round me, and as I pursued my way to greet my hostess, they opened out to allow me to pass. It was a scene of mythic proportions, the crowd parting like the Red Sea, all eyes drawn to the vision in white. Yet it was not merely the dress, nor even her fame as a professional beauty that caused this ripple in the ballroom. London knew that the Prince of Wales, the man whose whims could shape fashion, whose favor could make fortunes, was very interested in the delectable Mrs. Langtry. Lillie's first brush with royalty came not with the prince himself, but with two of his siblings, Princess Louise and Prince Leopold, the Queen's youngest son. Both harbored a taste for the unconventional, preferring artistic circles where bohemian ideals drifted through the air like pipe smoke. Princess Louise, at 29, was handsome and emancipated, a sculptress with a sharp tongue and an even sharper wit. Prince Leopold was a different kind of royal altogether. Slim and slight, with soulful eyes, a waxed mustache, and a wispy beard, he had the romantic air of a character stepped from a Byron poem. Known as the Scholar Prince, he possessed a marked intellectuality, but his life unfolded as a quiet tragedy, a struggle between his mother's suffocating possessiveness and his own yearning for independence. While Queen Victoria sought to keep him cloistered within Windsor's protective walls, Leopold longed for a world beyond them. He found a glimpse of that world in Lillie. The prince often visited Miles's studio to watch as the artist sketched Lillie, each line of charcoal a tribute to her beauty. On one occasion, he purchased a portrait of her, an exquisite profile with her name delicately suggested by a background of faintly penciled lines. The portrait hung above his bed, a quiet rebellion against the world that confined him. When Leopold was laid low by yet another bleeding attack, Queen Victoria arrived in his room. Her gaze fell upon the portrait of Mrs. Langtry. Without a word, the queen, who had ruled over empires, climbed onto a chair and with her own hands took it down. And with that, Lillie vanished from the walls of Windsor. Lillie's introduction to the Prince of Wales came at an intimate supper party on May 24, 1877, hosted by Sir Alan Young at his home in Stratford Place. The guest list was modest, just 10, including Mr. and Mrs. Edward Langtry. The timing was impeccable. The Princess of Wales was abroad, visiting her brother King George. The prince, newly returned from the south of France, was unencumbered. His summer had not yet begun, but his holiday spirit was already in bloom. As the guests stood, awaiting the call to supper, a ripple of murmurs spread through the room. A voice, genial and guttural, carried from beyond the doorway. "I am afraid that I am a little late." The moment held. A heartbeat later, the Prince of Wales entered. For all her poise, Lillie felt the jolt of royalty, that involuntary quiver even the steadiest hearts knew in such company. Her first impression was a blur of medals, sashes, and the glint of orders pinned to a broad chest. but when the moment came, she curtsied with flawless grace. "I greatly enjoyed watching my husband go rather stammeringly through a similar ordeal," she later admitted, the glint of mischief still in her words. At the table, Sir Alan had, of course, seated Lillie beside the prince. Beneath the glow of candelabras, Bertie plied her with his well-honed courtship, the chuckling laugh, the lingering glance, the charm that could disarm as much as seduce. Lillie knew what it meant when the Prince of Wales sought a woman's company. As she sank into her parting curtsy, she understood. His visits were not merely social calls, but declarations of interest. And an afternoon call from Bertie was never just an afternoon call. With his insatiable appetite for pleasure, he was more than just the future king. He was the arbiter of fashion, the architect of social trends, and, in no small measure, the author of a new code of aristocratic conduct. In a world where upper-class girls were expected to remain untouched until marriage, their male counterparts had always indulged elsewhere, seducing servant girls or frequenting London's countless brothels. Bertie preferred a different approach. If discretion and decorum shaped his public life, his private tastes leaned toward young married women whose allure lay not just in their beauty, but in their wit, charm, and ability to move seamlessly through both the drawing rooms of Mayfair and the embrace of a lover. His influence softened society's view of adultery, transforming it from a whispered sin into an accepted convention, provided, of course, it was conducted with civility. Their affair followed a well-trodden path, its choreography as practiced as any minuet. After their flirtation at supper, a discreet letter arrived at Lillie's Eaton Place address, proposing an afternoon call. These visits were part of an unspoken ritual among the upper crust. A gentleman would arrive during the hours when husbands were safely occupied at their clubs or engaged in their own liaisons. His hat, cane, and gloves would not be left in the hall, but arranged on a chair in the drawing room, signaling that he had merely dropped in for a polite call. The scene was one of carefully curated elegance. A maid, aproned and discreet, would set the tea tray, silver polished to a mirror shine, china delicate, the cake stand laden with dainties. She would curtsy and withdraw, leaving her mistress to ring the bell only when the visit was concluded. What happened between the click of the door and the tinkle of the bell remained a matter of imagination. Sometimes it was only conversation, veiled in flirtation. Other times, the chaise longue bore witness to exchanges of a more intimate nature, albeit ones constrained by the labyrinth of corsets, lace, and the elaborate constructions of Victorian fashion. Whether during one of these afternoon calls or in the more comfortable setting of a country house weekend, it became clear that Lillie was not merely another fleeting fancy. Bertie's fascination went beyond the casual. She was not to be hidden away or whispered about. She was to be seen. Soon, hostesses understood that if they wished for the prince's company, Mrs. Langtry must be on the guest list. Where he went, she followed, not as a shadow, but as a star in her own right. There was nothing clandestine about their affair. Lillie Langtry became an openly acknowledged, almost permanent feature of the prince's life. She was not merely a passing amusement, but his first official mistress, a paradoxical role in Victorian England, where scandal and status walked hand in hand. She tread the fine line between respectability and notoriety with a poise that few could match. For Lillie, this new role brought not only attention but influence. She became a fixture in the grand houses of London, a name whispered with admiration, envy, and curiosity. But at what cost? In her later years, Lillie would confess that she had always harbored a quiet fear of the Prince of Wales. Up close, he reeked of cigars. Yet in his presence, she remained composed, pragmatic, and above all, ambitious. Like the self-made industrialists Bertie so admired, she had forged her own path. She was no mere ornament at his side, but a formidable conversationalist, a woman whose intelligence was as intoxicating as her beauty. Oscar Wilde, ever her devoted friend, captured it best. Lillie's beauty has no meaning. Her charm, her wit, and her mind, what a mind, are far more formidable weapons. Years later, George Bernard Shaw would quip, "I resent Mrs. Langtry. She has no right to be intelligent, daring, and independent as well as lovely." It is a frightening combination of attributes. It was a combination the Prince of Wales found irresistible. Lillie, too, found herself swept up in the currents of her own notoriety. It would be difficult for me to analyze my feelings at this time, she later reflected. To pass in a few weeks from being an absolute nobody to what the Scotch so aptly describe as a person. To find myself not only invited to, but watched at all the great balls and parties. To hear the murmur as I entered the room. To be compelled to close the yard gates to avoid the curious, waiting crowd outside before I could mount my horse for my daily canter in the Row. Surely, I thought, London has gone mad. Her name, once an obscure footnote in Jersey society, now coursed through the streets of the capital like an electric current. It was no longer just dowagers on gilt chairs craning their necks at society balls. London itself was enthralled. In Hyde Park, crowds surged toward her. In Bond Street, shopkeepers had to smuggle her out through back doors to escape the mobs. Even young women who happened to resemble her became unintentional martyrs to her fame. One such girl was trampled in the frenzy, carried unconscious to St. George's Hospital. Everything she touched became a trend. One evening, in a moment of absent-minded elegance, she twisted a strip of black velvet into a simple toque, pinned a quill through it, and set it atop her golden hair. By morning, milliners had copied it and displayed it in shop windows under a single, knowing label, the Langtry hat. When she wore a pink gown to Ascot, every lady of fashion scrambled to don the same shade. The days of the single black dress were over. Now, she draped herself in Worth, in silks the color of dusk and velvets heavy with embroidery. Her tea gowns shimmered with silver fox, her evening dresses sparkled with pearls, her negligées whispered with ermine. At a ball at Marlborough House, she arrived in a gown of yellow tulle, overlaid with a wide-meshed gold net, beneath which real butterflies, preserved in fragile stillness, fluttered faintly with her every movement. By morning, the prince himself had been seen stooping to gather the fallen butterflies from the ballroom floor. London's greatest artists clamored to immortalize her. Edward Poynter cast her as a Renaissance princess, draped in gold. George Frederick Watts stripped away the finery, painting her in solemn black as the Dean's daughter. Burne-Jones, inspired by her luminous health, used her face for two figures in the Golden Stair. He painted her as Dame Fortune, a cool, detached goddess turning a great wheel upon which kings and princes climbed to their apex, only to tumble into ruin beneath the weight of fate. James McNeill Whistler, ever the aesthete, saw something else in her. One afternoon, as she posed in his Tite Street studio, the critic George Smalley observed her. A vision never to be forgotten, the coloring brilliant and at the same time delicate, the attitude all grace. There was harmony and contrast all in one, the softness and the strength. For a woman who had once lived in the quietest corners of Jersey, even her home required an evolution. She and her husband Edward, who, by all accounts, remained dutifully unprotesting, moved into a more fitting residence, 17 Norfolk Street, off Park Lane. Yet, by the standards of royal mistresses past, it was a modest affair. The days when kings housed their favorites in palatial estates had long faded. This was a new era, one of discretion. A private townhouse with its own entrance and the requisite air of plausible deniability was more befitting the times. And Bertie, for all his charm, was not a man of lavish financial arrangements. He gifted expensive jewels, perhaps the occasional gown, but beyond that, Lily was expected to fend for herself. And she did. Though she later claimed to have been financially reckless, those who knew her understood the truth. She was shrewd. Where other professional beauties posed for photographs merely for vanity, Lily ensured that she profited from every print sold. Fame, after all, had its privileges. London's finest couturiers and jewelers now extended her credit, knowing that if Lillie Langtry wore their creations, so too would the rest of high society. Norfolk Street became the stage for this new life. It was here that Bertie paid his afternoon calls, and on rare occasions lingered for supper. In her memoirs, Lily was discreet. His affability to servants was well known to all who entertained him, for he seldom passed one without a word or a kind look, she wrote. He really worked hard to make one's dinners and parties successful, an easy task with his magnetic personality. And as for her own role in it all, my only purpose in those days was to look nice and be pleasant, Lily would say. With characteristic grace and dignity, Princess Alexandra turned a blind eye, as she had to her husband's past indiscretions. But if Bertie's previous liaisons had been fleeting, this was different. Lillie Langtry was no passing fancy. And yet, Alexandra neither raged nor withdrew. Instead, with the quiet magnanimity that defined her, she extended a kindness to her husband's mistress, welcoming her into the rarefied world of Marlborough House and Sandringham. Lillie later recalled an evening when she fell ill at a small dinner party. The princess, always considerate and compassionate, immediately told me to hurry home to bed. Half an hour later, the household physician, Francis Laking, was ushered into my room, sent by the Princess of Wales herself to tend to me. The next afternoon, as I lay resting, the butler suddenly announced Her Royal Highness. Though unwell, Lillie struggled to her feet, but Alexandra insisted she remain on the sofa while she prepared their tea. The visit was unexpectedly warm. The princess chatted graciously, the air perfumed with the scent of her signature violets. For Edward Langtry, the situation was altogether different. To be a husband cuckolded by a prince was a peculiar humiliation, one laced with contradictions. A man might feel wounded, resentful, degraded, yet to object too strongly would be unthinkable. And yet Edward Langtry was neither obliging nor resigned. Though his marriage had long ceased to be a romantic one, jealousy still flickered beneath his indolence. By nature, he was lethargic, incurious, unambitious, but when provoked, his temper could be violent. Lillie later recounted moments of sudden rage, of bitter accusations flung in drunken fury, not merely over her extravagance or ceaseless socializing, but over the one thing that placed her beyond his reach. The Prince of Wales. His discovery of the affair was neither cinematic nor scandalous. There were no confrontations, no storming of doors, no letters waved in fury. Instead, it was mundane in its treachery. Like any Victorian husband versed in quiet suspicion, Edward understood the power of blotting paper. Holding it up to a looking glass, he deciphered the ghostly imprint of a letter Lillie had written to her royal lover. Rage swelled within him. Even the ever-resilient Lillie, usually impervious to his temper, was reduced to tears. And yet, for all his fury, Edward did not demand the affair end. Nor did he remove himself from its periphery. He continued to escort Lillie to grand dinners, country house weekends, and endless social engagements he loathed. Not out of devotion to her, but out of deference to the prince. But such a role required its own anesthetic. Edward, once an indulgent drinker, now clung to alcohol as his only solace. Whiskey dulled the nights spent alone. Brandy numbed the nights spent in company. There were evenings, Lillie later recalled, when he was too drunk to attend a dinner party, leaving her to scramble with last-minute apologies to hostesses who cared little for him, but everything for her. And yet, for all his grudging compliance, he refused to grant her a divorce. Even when her affair with Bertie had faded into memory, even when she had left their home, even when she had become an internationally celebrated actress, Edward Langtry would not let her go. For those intoxicating years at the height of the affair, Lillie Langtry adapted her life almost entirely to Bertie's. His world became hers, and no ritual was more central to that world than the daily spectacle of Hyde Park. This was no idle promenade. It was a living tableau, an orchestrated performance where power paraded in full display. The only stretch that mattered lay between Albert and Grosvenor Gates, where lacquered carriages rolled like polished pearls in procession, their footmen resplendent in livery, their horses high-stepping in perfect unison. Ladies swathed in silks and lace waved languidly from their barouches. Gentlemen in immaculate riding attire exchanged nods heavy with unspoken alliances. And at the apex of this moving court, Princess Alexandra. Seated in her signature claret-colored barouche, she was the embodiment of untouchable grace. Her bow, a delicate, effortless tilt of the head, sent ripples through the crowd. Hats were doffed, curtsies swept, and then there was Lillie. Clad in a faultlessly tailored riding habit, a top hat perched at a rakish angle, she rode alongside the Prince of Wales, her horse Redskin, a gift from an admirer, keeping perfect pace with his. Bertie, unmistakable in the saddle of his horse, adorned with a royal red brow band, cut a commanding figure. The sight of them together sent murmurs cascading through the throng, the undercurrent of whispers as charged as the clipped rhythm of hooves on gravel. One evening, caught in the languid pleasure of the ride, Bertie showed no sign of turning back. Lillie, bound by etiquette, had no choice but to follow. By the time she returned to Norfolk Street, the city's lamps had flickered to life. It was after 9. Edward was waiting. They were due at a dinner party, and Lillie barely had time to shed her riding clothes before being bundled into an evening gown and rushed to their carriage. When they arrived, just before 10, the guests had been waiting for hours. Bertie lived for the turf, reveling in the glorious uncertainty of it all. He surrounded himself with racing men, trusted them implicitly, and took their advice as gospel. Lillie, ever the quick study, did not merely observe, she absorbed. Racing was not just a spectacle to her, it was a science, a discipline. In time, she would become a formidable racehorse owner, twice winning the Cesarewitch handicap. For me, she later wrote, the pleasures of the turf are not merely in owning horses and seeing them win. I love the routine of racing. The fresh air, the picnic lunch, the rural surroundings, all make for a delightful outing. Her ascent was swift, her social sphere ever widening. It was only a matter of time before she was presented to the Prime Minister himself, Benjamin Disraeli. The encounter took place just before Ascot. The great statesman, ever the charmer, regarded the young woman before him with amusement. "And what can I do for you, Mrs. Langtry?" he asked, a knowing glint in his eye. Lillie, without hesitation, replied, 4 new gowns for Ascot. Disraeli smiled. "You are a very sensible young woman," he said. "Many a lady would have asked to be made a duchess in her own right." It was a remark made in jest, but beneath it lay a quiet truth. Disraeli, steeped in history, understood what Lillie had not yet fully grasped. Had she lived in another era, beneath the gilded ceilings of Versailles or within the intrigue-laden corridors of the Stuart court, she would have wielded far more than mere influence. She would have had a title, an estate, a pension for life. But this was a different age. The role of a royal mistress had shrunk to the shadowed corners of private townhouses, to discreet entrances and borrowed jewels. For all her power, Lillie Langtry was still just a guest at the table, not the one setting it. For Lillie Langtry, Marlborough House was no mere drawing room. It was an arena. A celebrated beauty might dazzle for a season, but Lillie had no intention of being a passing fascination. She became a presence, her name slipping from lips in salons and supper clubs alike, spoken with admiration, envy, and the irresistible pull of curiosity. The rituals of entry to Bertie's court were an orchestrated spectacle in themselves. Gleaming carriages arrived in procession. Scarlet-clad footmen, polished as their brass buttons, attended to the elite, while pages in navy livery ushered them through a labyrinth of antechambers, where candlelight flickered over cut crystal and anticipation shimmered beneath the hum of conversation. Then, at last, came the grand entrance. Lillie, ever the diplomat, described Alexandra, the Princess of Wales, in tones of reverence, recalling her as wonderfully lovely and faultlessly dressed, seeming almost to dim the beauty of every other woman in the room. Yet, for all the grace of the princess, it was Bertie who commanded the evening, his boundless energy and geniality electrifying the space around him. One guest, attending a ball at Sandringham, would later remark that the prince was the life of the party, the antidote to every text and sermon ever preached upon the pleasure of the world, palling upon the wearied spirit. For Bertie, society was not duty but delight, and nowhere was his appetite for revelry more insatiable than at Cowes, where summer unfolded in a spectacle of sale, scandal, and sport. As London languished beneath the heavy heat of July, the aristocracy abandoned their drawing rooms for the sea, descending upon the Isle of Wight for Cowes Week, a playground of yacht races, midnight revels, and mischief thinly veiled as merriment. Lillie did not simply observe, she lived it. She raced with the same reckless thrill she brought to life itself, later recalling, "How I enjoyed the excitement, crowding on sail to the verge of danger, with swirling spray drenching us to the skin." She and Bertie were frequent guests aboard the Helen, a schooner belonging to Sir Alan Young, the very man who had first introduced them. Meanwhile, aboard the Osborne, Bertie presided over his court of the highborn and the fallen. English aristocrats rubbing shoulders with dethroned emperors, exiled princes, and relics of crumbled dynasties. Among them was the Empress Eugenie, once the most dazzling woman in Europe, now a widow in exile, a living reminder of how swiftly fortune turns. But for all its grandeur, Cowes was not a place of solemn reflection. It was a playground of excess. And if Cowes had a king of mischief, It was Lord Charles Beresford. A naval officer of distinction but a prankster of impossible audacity, Beresford lived for amusement, and on one fateful evening, Lillie Langtry and the Prince of Wales found themselves unwilling players in his latest jest. It was a night of dance aboard HMS Thunderer, and at some point, Lillie and Bertie slipped away, whether for a stolen moment of privacy or something altogether more scandalous, no one could say. But Beresford, ever the opportunist, saw his chance. Knowing that the ship's cabins relied on air shafts for ventilation, he turned a lever and sealed the room shut. The air thickened. A moment's secret became a lesson in suffocation. The heat clung to their skin, their breaths turned shallow. Lillie clutched at her throat, her usual composure cracking under the growing pressure. Bertie, bewildered, fumbled toward the door. Just as their faces burned crimson with distress, the air supply was restored, along with Beresford himself grinning in the corridor. Lillie, ever the storyteller, later recounted the moment with wry amusement. Very soon, our faces became scarlet, our breathing grew difficult, and we went through the uncomfortable sensation that must be experienced by a fish out of water. Fortunately, Lord Charles did not go beyond the frightening limit, or the Beresford joke might have developed into the Beresford tragedy. A house party among Britain's aristocracy was not a mere gathering, it was a performance, its rhythms dictated by unspoken rules and rigid custom. Between 20 and 40 guests arrived, but introductions were never necessary. Anyone worth knowing already knew everyone else. The vast country estates, great halls gilded in candlelight, endless libraries perfumed with old parchment, manicured gardens winding towards secluded belvederes, were entirely at the guests' disposal, the stage upon which this rarefied world unfolded. Even the bedrooms, no less opulent, catered to every comfort but one, a bathroom. Instead, housemaids, silent as shadows, filled and emptied metal tubs behind embroidered screens, ensuring that even the act of bathing remained an exercise in discreet privilege. Yet, for all their splendor, these weekends could be a test of endurance. Meals were no mere sustenance, they were spectacle. At breakfast, silver chafing dishes gleamed beneath the morning light, offering fried, poached, and scrambled eggs, alongside bacon, sausages, mushrooms, tomatoes, kedgeree, and cold ham. Luncheon, sometimes taken as a picnic, was a banquet in miniature. Tables groaning beneath the weight of game pies, spiced meats, and wine poured without restraint. Afternoon tea was a symphony of indulgence, a delicate crescendo of cucumber sandwiches, warm scones, golden crumpets, and sugared fruit tarts. Dinner was the crowning spectacle. 10 courses, each a decadent procession, each paired with its own wine. And yet, long past midnight, another meal awaited. Cold chicken, lobster salad, and wine left temptingly within reach. For those who still felt peckish in the small hours, sandwiches were discreetly placed in every bedroom, silent offerings to the insatiable appetites of the privileged. For men, fashion was effortless. Tweed for the hunt, velvet smoking jackets for the drawing room, white tie and tails for dinner. For women, it was an unrelenting burden. A lady changed at least 4 times a day, morning dress for breakfast, sporting tweeds for a brisk ride or something lighter if remaining indoors, an elaborate tea gown for afternoon conversation, a full-length evening gown, plunging, jewel-encrusted, draped in lace, accompanied by an ostrich feather fan. While men smoked cigars and wagered fortunes over cards, women were left to write letters, exchange whispers, and entertain darlings, the carefully selected men whose sole purpose was to amuse them. For Lillie, these weekends were not an unmitigated delight. She had no patience for gossiping women, and even less for the bloodlust of the hunt. "I was once persuaded to see a stag stalked," she later recalled, "but I felt so sick and sorry for the fine beast that I have never forgotten it." Instead, she immersed herself in art and antiquities, drawn to the timelessness of beauty rather than the frivolity of society. "It was in these rooms that I learned to distinguish the different periods of French furniture and china," she recalled. The library was vast, filled with portfolios of rare engravings, each more exquisite than the last. She absorbed it all, her ambition refining her into something more than a celebrated beauty. She was becoming cultured, discerning, formidable. One evening, at a gathering in Alfred de Rothschild's resplendent residence, the financier drew her aside. "What shall I give you, beautiful lady?" he he murmured. Lillie, without hesitation, lifted a jeweled Louie XVI snuff box, turning it over in her hands, inspecting it with the trained eye of a connoisseur. "This will do," she said crisply. Rothschild paled. Later, with wry amusement, she recalled, "He had a weak heart, and for a moment, I thought I had stopped it." Regaining his breath, he forced a smile. No, he stammered. "I shall find you something much prettier." But the moment had passed. He had expected a charming fool. Instead, he found a woman who knew precisely what she wanted and was not afraid to take it. Not all of Lillie Langtry's time in England's great estates was spent cultivating intellect or influence. Beneath her polished exterior, an impetuous spirit burned bright, playful, irreverent, untamed. One host, to his growing frustration, was forced to lock away his largest silver tray after Lillie insisted on using it to toboggan down the grand staircase. Another chided her for an unladylike disregard of conventionalities. After she dismissed the groom assigned to follow her and Lord Manners on their morning ride. Such irreverence delighted the Prince of Wales. Bertie roared with laughter at her antics, drawn not only to her beauty, but to her spontaneity, boldness, and invincible zest for life, a temperament that so closely mirrored his own. Yet if house parties were a stage for laughter, they were also a theater of seduction. These weekends were as much about clandestine affairs as they were about grand feasts and glittering company. In the private world of country estates, a new aristocratic code of adultery flourished. From the moment guests arrived, gathering in drawing rooms over delicate cups of afternoon tea, the stage was set. Men, scanning the shimmering assembly, assessed which married women might offer a weekend's amusement. The courtship unfolded with elegant formality, glances exchanged across candlelit dinners, a fleeting touch on a gloved elbow, a whispered promise in the conservatory, a note slipped onto a breakfast tray, a moonlit stroll to the summer house, a volume of poetry left open on a chaise lounge, its dog-eared page betraying intention. And by nightfall, the assignations began. A skilled hostess took care to anticipate these liaisons. Married couples were often assigned separate rooms, ensuring husbands and wives had the freedom to conduct themselves as they pleased. Mrs. Langtry, for instance, was never placed far from the suite reserved for His Royal Highness. Equally, renowned philanderers were tactfully lodged far from the quarters of the blissfully, or willfully, ignorant, yet discretion was paramount. Affairs were permitted, but scandal was forbidden. Everything was all right, one errant wife later admitted, if only it was kept quiet, hushed up, covered. Indeed, the corridors of these great houses whispered with movement, the rustling of silk dressing gowns, the soft padding of slippered feet, the near-silent click of closing doors. A 6 o'clock warning bell ensured that every guest had returned to their rightful bed before the maids arrived with morning tea. But where desire reigns, folly follows. Even the Prince of Wales himself was not immune to error. One evening, a woman hesitant to accept his advances promised that she would mark her door with a rose. Later that night, Bertie, slipping into the chamber, found not his intended paramour, but a bewildered kitchen maid, nestled in the wrong bed. Not that a man of Bertie's station would hesitate to seduce a maid. Servants were seen as fair game, their resistance largely irrelevant. And yet, while aristocratic men indulged freely in extramarital affairs, they imposed a merciless moral code upon their servants. When Lord Curzon discovered that a housemaid had spent the night with a footman, he was incensed. "I put the little slut out into the street at a moment's notice," he later boasted. The double standard was absolute. For the first years of their affair, however, Bertie's attentions belonged to Lillie alone. When they were apart, he wrote to her constantly, his tone warm, indulgent, almost domestic. His letters brimmed with the trivialities of an affectionate husband, musings on the weather, the day's shooting, the results of a race. If a new beauty had caught his eye at Cowes, he was quick to reassure Lillie that he had not been tempted to flirt. Sometimes he enclosed a brace of pheasants from the hunt. At others, the coveted ticket to Ascot that Lillie had requested for a friend. For now, Lillie was his singular delight. Her ascent into society had been meteoric, but its final, undeniable confirmation came with her presentation at court. On a warm May afternoon in 1878, Lillie Langtry stood among a line of women stiff with nerves. each awaiting her moment to curtsy before the Queen. Though honored by the invitation, Lillie was uneasy at the prospect of facing Queen Victoria. By now, the Queen was well aware of her son's liaison with the striking Mrs. Langtry. Lillie, for her part, admitted she was rather afraid of the Queen, but she also understood how to navigate royal protocol. Victoria, famously averse to long public engagements, was known to withdraw early from drawing rooms, leaving the Prince and Princess of Wales to oversee the proceedings. Lillie devised a plan. She would arrive late, ensuring that by the time she was called forward, the Queen would have already retired. It was a strategy that almost worked. The mall leading to Buckingham Palace was a spectacle, a river of gleaming carriages, caparisoned horses, and footmen resplendent in gold braid. Onlookers pressed against the railings, craning for a glimpse of London's elite, their eyes darting toward jeweled and feathered women visible through carriage windows. But inside those gilded carriages, the experience was far from glamorous. It was certainly anything but pleasant, Lillie later recalled, to sit in full costume, with low neck and bare arms, in the bright sunlight for the edification of the surging crowd. Many of the women had not eaten since morning, forced to nibble on sandwiches and sip from discreetly hidden flasks, a quiet indignity rarely acknowledged in the society columns. Yet the real test of endurance began inside the palace. The procession of aspiring presentees inched forward through a series of crush rooms, their heavy court trains folded over one arm, their delicate tulle veils snagging against the brocade of their neighbors' gowns. Lillie, confident in her perfectly timed arrival, was certain that by the time she stepped forward, the Queen would be long gone. Then came the announcement. "Mrs. Langtry comes next, Your Majesty." Lillie froze. The Queen was still there. To Lillie's astonishment, Victoria had remained beyond her usual allotted time, waiting for her. "It seems," Lillie later wrote, "that she had a great desire to see me and had stayed on in order to satisfy herself as to my appearance. It was even added that she was annoyed because I was so late in passing." As Lillie approached the dais, she felt the weight of the Queen's unchanging gaze. Victoria, seated in her customary low-necked, short-sleeved black gown, wore the blue sash of the Order of the Garter, ropes of pearls at her throat, and the unmistakable glitter of diamond orders pinned to her corsage. On her head, her small diamond crown gleamed under the chandeliers, a symbol of her dominion over an empire upon which the sun never set. For all her diminutive stature, she was formidable. "I was thrilled with emotion, loyalty, and pride," Lillie later confessed, but as she sank into her deep, sweeping curtsy, the Queen barely acknowledged her. Victoria extended her hand in a perfunctory manner, her expression impassive, her mouth firmly set. No smile, no flicker of amusement, no hint of approval. In a single moment, Lillie Langtry had been measured, observed, and dismissed. In the autumn of 1878, Lillie Langtry came tantalizingly close to an unprecedented private audience with Queen Victoria. One crisp afternoon, Lillie and Edward, accompanied by Lord Strathnairn and Lady Errol, set out for Balmoral, Queen Victoria's private retreat. For Lillie, it was her first and only glimpse of the legendary estate. She found it bleak and uninteresting, a far cry from the romantic Scotland of legend. The visit was not a formal audience with the Queen. That was unthinkable. Victoria did not receive uninvited guests. Instead, as custom dictated, the group signed their names in the visitor's book, a small act of deference and acknowledgement. Yet Lillie hesitated. Despite her recent presentation at court, she wondered whether inscribing her name in the Queen's book might be a presumption. Lady Errol reassured her. Having already been received at court, it was not only acceptable but expected. So with a steady hand, Lillie Langtry wrote her name into the royal ledger. They departed without incident. Some 20 minutes later, Queen Victoria herself glanced through the book. She paused. A name stood out. "I should like to have seen Mrs. Langtry," she remarked. It was an astonishing statement, one that defied all expectation. A rider was sent out at once, galloping down the Highland paths in a desperate bid to catch the Langtrys before they were too far away. But by the time he reached Glen Tanar, they were long gone, and the opportunity was lost forever. Though Lillie never mentioned him in her memoirs, Balmoral was not merely Victoria's domain. It was also the stage for one of the most controversial figures of her reign, John Brown. By the time of Lillie's visit, Brown's presence in the Queen's household had become both permanent and fiercely debated. A rugged Highland gillie with striking features and a blunt, uncompromising manner, Brown had served the Queen for years. But after the death of Prince Albert, his role had shifted from loyal servant to something far more intimate. According to many in the Queen's circle, and even many biographers, Queen Victoria's relationship with John Brown was not one of mere companionship, but something far deeper, something that had long been whispered but never confirmed. With an insider writing, Brown was a rude, unmannerly fellow, but he had unbounded influence with the Queen, whom he treated with little respect, presuming in every way upon his position with her. It was the talk of all the household that he was the Queen's lover. He was a fine man physically, though coarsely made, and had fine eyes, like the late Prince Consort's, it was said. And the Queen, who had been passionately in love with her husband, got it into her head that somehow the prince's spirit had passed into Brown. 4 years after her widowhood, being very unhappy, she allowed him all privileges. The implication was unmistakable. Victoria, lost in grief, had found in Brown not just emotional solace, but something more. Behind the walls of secluded cottages, beyond the reach of courtly scrutiny, she had carved out a private world where her ladies-in-waiting were lodged at a distance, and Brown himself was housed in a chamber directly beside her own. It was an arrangement that defied all royal propriety, one that, according to rumor, granted Brown every conjugal privilege. If true, it was an astonishing breach of protocol, yet it fit within the paradoxes of the Victorian age, an era where outward morality was so often a mask for the far murkier realities of private life. To Bertie, however, Brown was nothing more than an interloper, a low-born Scot who had manipulated his mother's affections, and worse still, spoken to him with a familiarity no commoner should have dared assume. Their clashes were frequent, their mutual loathing one of the few tensions Victoria could never mend. When the Queen privately published more leaves from a journal of our life in the Highlands, its pages brimming with effusive praise for Brown, Bertie was appalled. He read it with mounting horror, knowing the scandal it would provoke. "You must not release this to the general public," he warned. But Victoria, imperious as ever, ignored him. The book was published. The whispers swelled into something louder. Bertie's resentment deepened. So absolute was his hatred for Brown that, upon his mother's death, one of his first acts as king was to erase every trace of the man she had so adored. Busts, statues, plaques, anything that bore Brown's name was destroyed. It was an act of calculated vindictiveness from a man rarely prone to cruelty. Even in death, Brown had not escaped Bertie's wrath. Whether Victoria and John Brown had truly been lovers will never be known. But the fact that so many believed it, that even the royal family itself was divided over the question, speaks to something deeper than mere rumor. With Lily's rising status came an ever-expanding constellation of powerful acquaintances. At Cowes, she exchanged pleasantries with King Christian and Queen Louise of Denmark, the parents of Princess Alexandra. Signed portraits arrived from Prince Wilhelm of Glücksburg and King Oscar of Sweden, tangible proof that she was now playing at the highest levels of European society. But it was at Marlborough House that the stakes rose even higher. Over a glittering dinner, she found herself in the company of the future German emperor and empress, then still the crown prince and princess. Even Bertie's sons, Prince Albert Victor, known as Eddie, and his younger brother, Prince George, came to know her, as she gifted them each a small token. Eddie, ever eager to please, wasted no time affixing it to his watch chain. "I had to take off my grandmother's locket to make room for it," he declared with unshaken pride. One wonders what Queen Victoria would have made of such an exchange. Not all royal encounters, however, were so light-hearted. There was, for instance, the towering figure of Leopold II, King of the Belgians, a man whose reputation for personal debauchery was whispered behind cupped hands across Europe. He found his own kingdom unbearably provincial, preferring the diversions of Paris and London, where his insatiable appetites were more easily indulged. Perhaps assuming Lillie would be as obliging as his cousin, the Prince of Wales, he arrived at her home unannounced, at the ungodly hour of 9 a.m. Jolted from sleep, Lillie dressed hastily and rushed downstairs to find the Belgian king, drenched from the rain, waiting with unnerving patience. The visit, though prolonged, remained entirely proper, or so she later assured her readers. When he arrived at the same hour the following morning, she sent her regrets. If Leopold was persistent, Crown Prince Rudolf of Austria was relentless. The only son of Emperor Franz Joseph and the brilliant but tormented Empress Elizabeth, Rudolf had inherited his mother's restless fascination with the world beyond the rigid confines of the Habsburg court. At one party, the young prince, charming but reckless, claimed nearly every dance, his fixation bordering on the impetuous. When the royal party retired for supper, he paid no attention to his assigned companion and insisted Lillie be seated beside him instead. But if Rudolph's passion burned bright, it lacked grace. His enthusiasm as a dancer outpaced his skill, and his hands, damp with exertion, left imprints on the delicate fabric of Lillie's gown. With as much tact as possible, she gently suggested he wear his gloves. His response was blunt, graceless, and wholly unbecoming of an imperial heir. "It is you who are sweating, madam," he retorted. If she had ever entertained the notion of indulging his attentions, that moment likely put an end to it. Yet the young prince was undeterred. In the days following, he became a frequent caller at Norfolk Street. Whether Lillie encouraged his advances or merely endured them out of politeness remains unknown, but one thing is certain. Rudolf was obsessed. Years later, she reportedly recounted the moment. One evening, when his intentions became unmistakably dishonorable, she feigned outrage. With a dramatic flourish, she took the emerald ring he had just gifted her and flung it into the fire. Rudolf, horrified, dropped to his knees, frantically raking through the burning coals to retrieve it. "I couldn't have loved him after that," she later shrugged. But she kept the ring. A decade later, the world would be scandalized by the prince's grim fate. In 1889, at the Imperial Hunting Lodge of Mayerling, he shot first his young mistress, Mary Vetsera, and then himself. The tragic end of Austria's troubled heir sent shockwaves through Europe. Looking back, his fascination with doomed romance and self-destruction had already begun to manifest in London. Whether Lillie saw any deeper darkness in him at the time is unknown. But one thing is certain. She had made the right choice in keeping her distance. Whatever amusement she might have found in adding the future Emperor of Austria-Hungary to her list of admirers, she was far too shrewd to risk alienating the Prince of Wales for a fleeting indulgence. Her position depended entirely on Bertie's favor, and she understood, better than most, how precarious that kind of patronage could be. Flirtation with Rudolf may have been entertaining, but it would remain just that. And yet, even as she kept the Habsburg prince at arm's length, Lillie was engaged in a far more clandestine romance. A battered green box discovered decades later in an attic in Jersey revealed 65 letters of longing, passion, and unmistakable devotion. They were addressed to a man named Arthur Henry Jones, and in them, Lillie's carefully constructed mask slipped away. "Please, please, hurry back," she pleaded. "I want you so much." Far from the calculating social climber some had accused her of being, these letters proved that Lillie Langtry was indeed capable of love. But unlike so many women before her, she would never let love consume her. She ensured that her affair with Arthur Jones remained entirely secret. She knew better than to let sentimentality dictate her fate. If there was any awareness of this secret liaison among her peers, it was never voiced. The gossips had more than enough material to speculate on without it. News of Lillie Langtry's growing list of royal admirers had already crossed the Atlantic, fueling endless fascination. The New York Tribune, seizing upon the rumors of her connection with Rudolf, proclaimed with mock admiration that lovely Lillie Langtry has added another royal scalp to her fast-growing collection. And so, the legend of Lillie Langtry grew. Her reputation had outgrown mere beauty. She was no longer just a celebrated face, but a figure of fascination, moving effortlessly through the upper echelons of society, attracting admiration from kings and poets alike. Her friendship with the young Oscar Wilde, forged in late 1879, would later foreshadow the dramatic shift her career would take. Wilde, fresh from Oxford, had taken up residence in the untidy yet romantic home of Lillie's artist friend, Frank Miles. In that haven of aesthetic indulgence, white-paneled walls adorned with peacock feathers, blue and white china and sunflowers, he surrounded himself with a coterie of beautiful people, where art and life blurred into a single shimmering performance. Among the three women he most admired, Queen Victoria, Sarah Bernhardt, and Lillie Langtry, Wilde famously declared that he would have married any one of them with pleasure. He extolled the Queen's dignity, the actress's voice, and Lillie's unparalleled grace. Lillie, however, was less enchanted. She found Wilde grotesque, his face too large, his complexion ghostly pale, his lips coarse, his teeth discolored, his nails unkempt. His clothes, exaggeratedly unconventional, scandalized even the most progressive salons. And yet something about him held her curiosity. His voice was unexpectedly melodious, and his exuberance infectious. His mannerisms, though theatrical, were at this stage an earnest display of unpolished genius, rather than the calculated affectations he would later adopt. For Wilde, however, Lillie was a siren, not just for her beauty and wit, but for her proximity to power as the mistress of the Prince of Wales. Determined to tether himself to that dazzling orbit, he performed his admiration with theatrical devotion. He adapted a poem originally written in praise of a youthful muse into a tribute to a Lily girl, presenting her with an elaborately inscribed copy of a new Helen. When visiting her, he would stroll down Piccadilly brandishing a single lily, ensuring all who saw him understood the homage. His declarations, however, extended beyond mere poetry. On one occasion, he reportedly fell asleep on her doorstep, as if overcome by passion. After a quarrel, he was found outside the theater in tears, so distraught that attendants had to lead him away. Yet Lillie was no fool. She saw through the spectacle. Wilde was not so much in love with her as he was with her notoriety. He used her scandal to fuel his own rise, even as he sought her favor. Yet their relationship was not without warmth. Wilde, ever eager to mold the world into something more beautiful, lavished her with artistic guidance. He led her through lectures on Greek art at the British Museum, introduced her to the venerable critic John Ruskin, and even instructed her in Italian. Lillie, self-possessed and shrewd, took what interested her and left the rest. She humored him with fashion consultations, once asking his advice on a ball gown. She ultimately chose a soft black Greek dress, accented with silver crescents and diamonds, which she named Queen of the Night. Wilde, predictably, thought her far too dull for rejecting his far grander vision, one that involved a bonnet emblazoned with Venus Anadomini. But even as Wilde preened and plotted, another storm was brewing. By late 1879, whispers circulated that the Prince of Wales was growing restless. Bertie, for all his affability, had a notoriously brief attention span for love. London's social scene always had new beauties to offer. Lillie, at 26, sensed the inevitable. Perhaps seeking security elsewhere, she allowed herself to be swept into the reckless infatuation of Lord Shrewsbury. Charles Chetwynd Talbot, the 18-year-old Earl of Shrewsbury, was not merely captivated. He was consumed. Their romance, which began in July 1879, was scandalous not just for its adultery, but for the unconventional dynamic, an older, married woman and a teenage aristocrat. Shrewsbury, blind with passion, proposed they elope. Lillie, ever one to seize her fate, considered it. For a moment, she stood on the precipice of a grand gamble, one that would mean abandoning everything she had built for a fleeting promise of devotion. But fate was unkind. Shrewsbury, impulsive as he was ardent, jilted her. Just as suddenly as he had pledged himself to Lillie, he redirected his affections to another, a married society lady, Ellen Palmer Morwood. He married her soon after, leaving Lillie both abandoned and humiliated. Only months earlier, society had worshipped her. Now, sensing vulnerability, the same elite circles that had once courted her favor turned with sharpened teeth. A scandalous falsehood appeared in the papers. Edward Langtry, it was claimed, had filed for divorce, naming the Prince of Wales as co-respondent. The allegation was wholly fabricated. Edward had done no such thing, but the damage was done. Bertie, ever mindful of his reputation, could not afford the scandal. He distanced himself from Lillie, though the two remained friends. Worse was to come. Prince Louie of Battenberg had never been merely another aristocratic ornament. His lineage, though tainted by the stain of morganatic origins, was steadily ascending in European society. The Battenbergs, once dismissed as minor princelings, were proving themselves a force within royal circles, and Louis, the eldest, was among the most promising. Unlike the idle young lords who drifted from ball to ball, He had carved out a career of his own. At 14, he had entered the British Navy and distinguished himself through discipline and intellect, a curiosity in a world where privilege often bred indolence. While his peers squandered their youth in rounds of champagne and scandal, he pursued excellence, earning the grudging respect of those who once dismissed him. Yet for all his diligence, he was no ascetic. Women found themselves drawn to his deep voice, his foreign accent, the way he wore his authority lightly yet irresistibly. His cousin, the Prince of Wales, had long taken an interest in him. Bertie had a keen eye for promising young men, and Louie had reaped the benefits: lavish entertainments, introductions to society's most glittering figures, and most significantly, an invitation into the dazzling world of Lillie Langtry. Unlike Bertie, Louie was neither jaded nor cynical. He approached her not as a conquest, but with a fervor that must have been intoxicating. His admiration went beyond her beauty. He was captivated by her mind. Unlike so many admirers who parroted empty flattery, he could speak of literature, philosophy, and art with genuine passion. Their affair unfolded with discretion, far from the scandal that had surrounded her previous lovers. Edward Langtry, as ever, was conveniently absent on endless fishing expeditions, leaving Lillie and Louie to meet in the privacy of her Norfolk Street home or in the country estates of sympathetic friends who understood the nature of these arrangements. But there was no illusion of permanence. Louie, for all his intensity, understood the constraints of his position. The Battenbergs had clawed their way into aristocracy, and one misstep could send them tumbling back into obscurity. A scandalous marriage would have been an unforgivable breach. He knew it. Lillie, ever pragmatic, must have known it too. And yet, in those fleeting months, she had found another royal companion, one who offered not only admiration, but true intellectual companionship. But by autumn of 1880, her carefully curated world began to collapse. She suspected she was pregnant, not by her husband, not by the Prince of Wales, but by Prince Louis of Battenberg. In her distress, she turned not to Louis, nor to Bertie, nor to any of her admirers, but to the man who had remained steadfast through the turbulence of her affections, Arthur Jones. Desperation laced her letters as she pleaded with him to inquire at a chemist about remedies that might delay the inevitable. But there was no delaying fate. When she finally confided in Louis, his response was not his own. The Battenbergs wasted no time in closing ranks. A marriage was unthinkable. They acted swiftly and decisively. An aide-de-camp was dispatched to arrange a quiet financial settlement, and after months of delays from the British Admiralty, Louis was suddenly assigned a distant naval post. On October 16, 1880, he set sail. His ship, in a cruel twist of irony, bore the name Inconstant. With that single stroke, Lillie lost everything. The Prince of Wales had already begun drifting from her orbit, his attention diverted elsewhere. The same society that had once vied for her presence now recoiled, sensing her diminishing influence. Even her husband had become a ghost, absent in every way but name, and her creditors, long held at bay by charm and whispered promises, now demanded their due. The situation was perilous. If Edward Langtry sued for divorce and named the Prince of Wales as co-respondent, it would drag Bertie into court in a public scandal. Every move had to be calculated, every word spoken in absolute discretion. So Lillie disappeared. In the autumn of 1880, London society awoke to find her gone. With royal arrangements quietly made, she was spirited away to Paris, her pregnancy concealed beneath layers of secrecy. On March 8, 1881, Lillie gave birth to a daughter. The child was born in the utmost secrecy. Even in exile, Lillie feared discovery. She wrote anguished letters to Arthur Jones, begging for help, wrestling with impossible decisions. But the child had arrived, a living, breathing scandal in a world that had no mercy for fallen women. Lillie faced an agonizing choice. Victorian society would never accept an openly illegitimate child from a woman of her standing. At just 27 years old, she was not ready to surrender to disgrace. So, with a heavy heart, she did what so many women before her had done. She sent her daughter into hiding. The child was taken to Jersey, raised not as Lillie's daughter, but as a distant relation, a foundling absorbed into the family fold. Whether she was raised by Lillie's mother or her brother remains uncertain. But what is known is this: she grew up believing that Lillie was her aunt, Not her mother. The truth would not be revealed until her teenage years, and even then, the name of her father remained a mystery. Shrouded in whispers and evasions, Lillie had saved her daughter from scandal. But in doing so, she had sown the seeds of an estrangement that would haunt her for the rest of her life. Back in London, the fallout was immediate. The same society that had once worshipped her now closed its doors. Financially, she was drowning. Her indulgent lifestyle and Edward's dwindling resources had left the Langtrys mired in debt. By late 1880, the creditors who had once extended endless favors now came knocking, demanding payment in full. Edward, once her feckless protector, was of no use. In later years, Lillie would describe him with biting dismissal, a penniless, drunken Irishman, useless to her when she needed him most. She might have retreated into quiet obscurity, dependent on the generosity of former admirers. That was the usual fate of women in her position. She had neither the temperament nor the inclination to become another forgotten mistress living on borrowed wealth. And so, she did something unthinkable. She got a job. With few options left, she resolved to capitalize on the only currency Victorian society had ever truly allowed her, her name. Encouraged by Oscar Wilde and the great Sarah Bernhardt, Lillie made a decision that scandalized the very world that had once adored her. She would become an actress. It was a gamble. In 1881, no woman of high society had ever set foot upon the stage without falling irrevocably from grace. The theater was a world apart, its actresses regarded as creatures of talent and scandal in equal measure. For those born into it, there was a degree of acceptance, but for a former darling of the aristocracy, the transition was little better than outright disgrace. The shift from being watched in admiration to being watched for entertainment was a fall in status that few would dare to endure. But for Lillie, there was no choice. Her debut was set. On December 15, 1881, the Haymarket Theatre swelled with the most fashionable of London's elite, gathered not out of goodwill, but out of a voracious curiosity to witness either her triumph or her humiliation. Even the Prince and Princess of Wales took their seats in the royal box, their presence lending the occasion an air of quiet judgment. The play was She Stoops to Conquer, a comedy of manners that had long been a favorite among British audiences. As the curtain rose and Lillie stepped onto the stage as Kate Hardcastle, the silence was deafening. For a moment, she stood before them, the weight of their scrutiny pressing upon her. Many had arrived with scorn already formed in their hearts, convinced that this would be the final act in her long, slow descent. But then, as the performance unfolded, something changed. Her voice, steady despite her nerves, carried through the theater. She was not a great actress. Her technique was unpolished, her presence more that of a poised hostess than a commanding performer. But she was compelling. Her beauty, her charm, the very essence of the Lillie Langtry legend, these remained intact. By the final act, the tide had turned. What had begun as skepticism ended in thunderous applause. The Times noted, somewhat begrudgingly, that she had overcome the feeling of prejudice, that her name alone had drawn an audience spanning all ranks of society. For the first time in history, a woman of Lillie's standing had crossed the rigid barrier between aristocracy and the stage and emerged not ruined, but reborn. Critics were measured in their praise, acknowledging her presence rather than her talent. Never a real actress, one wrote, she gradually acquired the technique, but never succeeded in touching the emotions. But Lillie was not deluded. She knew her strengths, and she played to them. She chose roles that mirrored her own persona. Elegant, witty, self-assured society women, performances that required charm rather than depth. And for audiences, that was enough. They did not come to see a masterful performance. They came to see Lillie Langtry. The transition was not without its challenges. The stigma of her past still clung to her, and there were those who expected, or rather wished for her to fail. But Lillie, ever pragmatic, found a way to make the theater work for her, rather than the other way around. By mid-1882, she had assembled her own touring company, bringing performances to the provincial towns that had only known her from scandal sheets in illustrated newspapers. The gamble paid off. Each stop was sold out. The legend of the Jersey Lillie was as potent in the countryside as it had been in the drawing rooms of London. Then came America. The offer arrived from Henry E. Abbey, a shrewd and ambitious American promoter. He promised her something no actress before her had ever received: a generous percentage of the gross receipts, a financial arrangement that placed her among the highest-paid performers of her time. The opportunity was irresistible. America offered something Britain no longer could: a fresh start, a new audience, a world unburdened by the weight of her past. But before she left, she made one final, brilliant move. In 1882, Lillie Langtry became the first celebrity to lend her image to a commercial product. Pears Soap, capitalizing on the fascination with her beauty, featured her face in their advertisements, claiming that the secret to her famous complexion lay in their product. Victorian consumers rushed to buy it. The campaign was a sensation. It was a stroke of genius. The idea of a famous woman endorsing a product was unheard of, and yet, Lillie had just created what would become one of the most lucrative marketing strategies of the modern age. Long before the world of film stars and fashion icons, before the golden age of Hollywood and the rise of celebrity branding, Lillie Langtry had pioneered the path that countless others would follow. By the end of 1882, she had done what few thought possible. In just over a year, she had gone from social ruin to theatrical success, from financial despair to international celebrity. And so, with her name restored, her fortune growing, and the world at her feet once more, Lillie Langtry boarded a ship bound for New York. She had conquered London, and now she would conquer America. In October 1882, New York City buzzed with anticipation for the arrival of Lillie Langtry. Oscar Wilde himself acted as her advance agent, stirring up publicity with his trademark wit. When Lillie stepped off the ship onto American soil, she found herself greeted as a star, the Mrs. Langtry, famed beauty of the English stage. High society women envied her style, men dueled for tickets to her shows. Her American debut in New York was nothing short of sensational. Accompanied by Wilde, who was lecturing on aestheticism, and a full troupe of actors, Lillie barnstormed through the United States. Audiences packed theaters to see her in As You Like It, Hours, and The Lady of Lions. She crisscrossed the continent by rail, from the eastern seaboard to the frontier west. I can hardly put my finger on any town sufficiently important to be marked on the map in which I have not played more than once, she later boasted of these years. It was no idle brag. She truly went everywhere. Chicago, Boston, Philadelphia, New Orleans, San Francisco. Even far-flung mining outposts welcomed the Jersey Lillie. One of her most ardent American admirers was Frederick "Freddie" Gabehard, a 22-year-old heir to a New York railroad fortune. Wilde introduced Freddie to Lillie in 1882, and the young man was instantly infatuated. Freddie became Lillie's devoted escort and quite possibly her lover during her U.S. tours. He lavished her with typically American excess, even commissioning a luxurious private railroad car so Lillie could travel the country in comfort. With Freddie at her side, Lillie ventured beyond the footlights to explore America's natural wonders. She was entranced by California, visiting Monterey's pine forests and the majestic Yosemite Valley with her besotted companion. California so captivated Lillie that she decided to put down roots there. In 1888, with financial help from Freddie, she purchased a ranch in Lake County, California. She named it Langtry Farms, and it featured established vineyards, orchards, and even a winery. Long before Napa Valley became synonymous with wine, Lillie Langtry was bottling her own California Red, complete with labels bearing her image. She brought in a French vintner to run the winery, marketing her Jersey Lillie Claret and Sherry to eager buyers. In doing so, Lillie became one of the first women vintners in California history. By deft marketing and her celebrity name, she turned the rural estate into another source of income. Between theatrical profits, endorsement deals, and land investments, Lillie was amassing a fortune, a dramatic reversal from her penniless plight just a few years prior. Lillie's American Odyssey sparked one of the quirkiest chapters in her legend, the tale of Judge Roy Bean and the Texas town of Langtry. Roy Bean was an eccentric saloon-keeper and self-appointed justice of the peace in a dusty West Texas outpost. Sometime in the early 1880s, he became obsessed with Lillie Langtry, purely from her pictures and press. In her honor, Bean renamed his saloon the Jersey Lillie, spelling Lillie with 2 L's for flair. He even christened the surrounding hamlet Langtry, Texas. although in truth, the railroad had already named it after an engineer. Bean happily spread the myth that it was named for Lillie. Styling himself as Lillie's #1 fan, Judge Bean decorated his ramshackle saloon and courthouse with her images and regaled patrons with stories of the Jersey Lillie. He would hold court beneath a portrait of Lillie, dispensing frontier justice in her name. Throughout the 1880s and 90s, Bean wrote letters to Lillie in care of her agent, inviting her to visit his far-flung opera house, as he grandly called his saloon. Whether those letters ever reached her is unclear, but Lillie later said she first learned of Judge Bean's devotion sometime during her travels. In March 1903, Roy Bean died, never having met his muse. But fate had a bittersweet twist. In January 1904, Lillie Langtry, by then in her 50s, was on a train tour from New Orleans to California and arranged to stop at Langtry, Texas. Stepping off the Southern Pacific Rail onto the dusty ground, she finally beheld the place that bore her name. Locals swarmed to greet her with tales of the late judge who had so idolized her. They showed her the Jersey Lillie Saloon, preserved like a shrine. The mayor of Langtry presented Lillie with Judge Bean's 6-shooter, the very revolver he had often brandished while proclaiming his adoration for her. Touched and amused, Lillie spent a short time touring the humble site, the closest she ever came to the peculiar Texas legend built around her. It was a short visit, but an unforgettable one, Lillie wrote fondly in her autobiography. She may have missed meeting her loyal subject, Roy Bean, in life, but her drop-in capped a story that has since become Wild West lore, immortalized later in books and even a Hollywood film. By the end of 1887, Lillie Langtry had achieved what she set out to do in America. She had earned fabulous sums, established business ventures, and expanded her fame globally. More importantly, she had proven, to the world and to herself, that she was more than the prince's cast-off mistress. She was an independent, financially successful woman in an era when such figures were rare. As one contemporary observed, she soon became one of the wealthiest independent women of her time through her shrewd investments and hard work. Yet, despite all this success, personal contentment still eluded Lillie in one area: her daughter. Little Jean Marie remained in Jersey, being raised away from her mother. Lillie rarely saw the child. By 1887, Jean was about 6. She likely believed her grandmother Emily was her mother, or at least had no inkling of Lillie's true role. Lillie provided financial support for her daughter, but emotional closeness was thwarted by the secrecy. This would have consequences years later, as we shall see. For now, as the 1890s dawned, Lillie Langtry returned to Britain in triumph. She had new challenges to tackle: running a grand London theater, breeding racehorses, navigating new love interests, and improbably marrying into the aristocracy for a second chance at love and respectability. Back in Britain, Lillie was greeted not with scorn, but with a sort of amused admiration. In the eyes of the public, she had redeemed herself. She was no longer merely the notorious Jersey Lillie. She was an established actress and a woman of means. Over the 1890s, Lillie continued to perform on stage in both London and America, but she also expanded her offstage pursuits, some triumphant, others calamitous. As the world watched, Lillie Langtry continued her unrelenting pursuit of reinvention. One of her greatest passions outside the stage was horse racing. It was not a newfound interest. Lillie had always been an accomplished rider, but in the mid-1890s, she elevated her fascination into a serious endeavor. Settling in Newmarket, the heart of English racing, she established a stable at Regal Lodge, where she surrounded herself with trainers, jockeys, and thoroughbreds of the finest pedigree. Unlike many society women who dabbled in racing for amusement, Lillie possessed an unerring instinct for horseflesh. She did not simply fund stables. She studied bloodlines, analyzed tracks, and engaged in the sport with the same meticulous attention that had driven her theatrical success. On a tip, she imported a chestnut stallion from Australia named Merman. It was a gamble, but Lillie was no stranger to risk. Under her ownership, Merman proved a spectacular stayer, winning some of the most prestigious races in England, including the Cesarewitch Handicap, the Goodwood Stakes, the Goodwood Cup, and in 1901, the ultimate prize, the Ascot Gold Cup. It was an astonishing achievement, one that cemented her status as a formidable owner in a world dominated by men. Society had long known Lillie as a daring rider and whip. Now she was making her mark as one of the few female racehorse owners to compete at the highest level. The racing establishment took notice, even naming a stakes race at Goodwood in her honor, a race that continues to be run today. Yet, as in all things, the heights of triumph came with their inevitable reversals. Fortunes in racing were as unpredictable as those in the theater. Some of her purchases proved poor investments, and injuries to key horses drained her finances. By 1919, she would sell off her stable and part ways with Regal Lodge. But in the 1890s, racing was more than an investment. It was a thrill, a statement of defiance, and above all, proof that she could succeed in any world she chose to enter. By day, she rode in her racing silks. By night, she returned to the stage. The theater, once a necessity for survival, had become a true vocation. In 1891, she embarked on a daring new project, leasing London's St. James's Theatre to star in As You Like It, playing the lead role of Rosalind. If critics had once scoffed at her abilities, they now found themselves faced with a woman who had refined her craft, who had honed her presence beyond mere beauty. The show sold out for 4 months. Buoyed by this success, she turned to a grander challenge, Antony and Cleopatra, a production that saw her cast as Shakespeare's most intoxicating queen. Many doubted she could embody the grandeur and tragedy of the role, but opening night proved otherwise. The Daily Telegraph declared her the finest Cleopatra of our time, noting the 14 curtain calls she received before a roaring audience. Perhaps the critics were generous, perhaps the spectacle of the costumes and staging carried her performance, but none could deny that it was a triumph. Lillie had never been one to rest on her laurels. With the wealth she had accrued, she made a bold move, one that no woman of her time had yet attempted. In 1901, she purchased the Imperial Theatre in London, pouring nearly £50,000 into its refurbishment. To own a theatre outright was almost unheard of for a woman, an assertion not only of financial power, but of artistic control. She envisioned producing plays, cultivating talent, and shaping the theatrical landscape as more than just a performer. But even Lillie Langtry, for all her instincts and audacity, could not will the theatre into success. The Imperial struggled. Perhaps the location was poor, perhaps the productions failed to resonate, or perhaps even she could not bend fortune to her will forever. Within a few years, the enterprise collapsed, and she was forced to sell the theatre at a significant loss. It was a blow, but one she bore with characteristic pragmatism. If she had learned anything in life, it was that reinvention was always possible. And so, as one chapter in her life ended, another began. In the late 1890s, she found herself drawn into a new romance, one that would, in time, lead her to yet another transformation. Her lover was Hugo de Bathe, a striking young man nearly 20 years her junior, whose charm and aristocratic pedigree made him a fixture in fashionable society. Their relationship was whispered about in drawing rooms, but it was not the difference in their ages that fueled the gossip. Rather, it was a peculiar rumor that refused to be silenced. That Hugo had first courted Lillie's daughter, Jeanne-Marie, only to become enamored of the mother instead. Whether the story was true or a fabrication of society's ever-wagging tongues was immaterial. The fact that it was believed spoke volumes of Lillie's enduring allure. Even as she approached middle age, she remained captivating, a woman whose presence still commanded attention, admiration, and most of all, curiosity. For Hugo, the attraction was immediate and unwavering. For Lillie, the appeal was more complex. She had spent over a decade proving to the world that she could stand alone, that she needed no man to define her. And yet, Hugo offered something no career, no racehorse, and no theater could provide. An unspoken return to the aristocracy that had once cast her out. As Lillie Langtry grew ever wealthier and more self-sufficient, her estranged husband, Edward Langtry, drifted further into destitution and obscurity. Years had passed since they last laid eyes on each other. Their only remaining connection came through George Lewis, the famed solicitor who dutifully sent Edward his quarterly £25 allowance, money that vanished into drink. With each installment, Lewis would also pass along Lillie's latest petition for divorce, and each time, Edward refused. The man who had once stood proudly beside his dazzling wife in the drawing rooms of Buckingham Palace and Marlborough House had become a shadow of himself, shuffling between lodging houses, his days spent idle and drunk. Yet his devotion to Lillie remained undiminished. For a time, he lived in Holyhead, tracking the schedules of steamers and trains, knowing precisely when she would pass through on her way to Dublin. Hours before her arrival, he would pace the platform in anxious anticipation, only to flee at the last moment. Instead, he would summon a porter. "Boy," he would whisper, his voice trembling, "watch her for me. Tell me how she looks. Does she still shine? What is she wearing? Be careful about her dress and tell me everything." Then he would disappear, leaving the young messenger to report back with reverence and pity. Detective Inspector Perkins, stationed at Holyhead, witnessed these pitiful episodes firsthand. After the train or boat had gone, he later recalled, he would return and question the porter, sobbing as if his heart would break at every detail. I have seen the porters themselves brought to tears at the sight of his despair. By 1893, Edward Langtry had taken lodging in Southampton. It was there, in 1897, that he learned, likely from George Lewis, that Lillie had finally secured her divorce. A judge in Lakeport, California, where she held property as an American citizen, had ruled in her favor. The decree, however, was dubious. English law did not recognize divorces granted in foreign courts, and rumors swirled that had Lillie remarried in Britain, she could have been prosecuted for bigamy. The news sent Edward into a state of deep agitation. He became extremely unhappy, a friend recalled. On September 29th, he abruptly announced his departure for London, telling Collins that he intended to meet a Mr. Arthur Greenwood for a journey to Belfast and Glasgow. What happened next remains a mystery. In London, Edward met Greenwood as planned, and together they traveled to Liverpool, where they boarded a ferry to Belfast. During the crossing, a steward found Edward sprawled on the deck, bloodied and bruised, his nose fractured. The cause of his injuries was uncertain. Some suggested he had stumbled on a step entering the smoking room, while others whispered of something more sinister. Greenwood took him to the Royal Hospital in Belfast before disappearing without a trace. By the time Collins arrived from Southampton, Edward had already discharged himself and was en route back to London. His condition deteriorated rapidly. In the early hours of October 3rd, he arrived at the station hotel in Crewe, his face heavily bandaged, his movements unsteady. He asked for a room but soon emerged again, claiming that strangers were lurking inside. When he was refused a drink, he blinked in confusion and muttered, "Oh, is it night?" By morning, he was back at the hotel, pleading again for alcohol, 2 bottles of bitter. Again, he was refused. Later that day, Detective Inspector Perkins, now stationed in Crewe, found him wandering the station platform. His injuries were so severe that Perkins barely recognized him. "Langtry, how did this happen?" he asked. Edward's answer was cryptic. "They thought they knocked me out this time, but they didn't." Drunken rambling or genuine accusation? The words ignited speculation. Had someone tried to do away with him? And if so, why? There were those who murmured that his death would have been most convenient for Lillie and her plans to remarry. With Edward gone, all complications would disappear. Whatever the truth, Edward's coherence unraveled. He spoke wildly to anyone who would listen, lamenting that his wife had divorced him in the colonies, seeming to have no sense of where he was meant to be. Soon after, he was taken before a magistrate and committed to Upton Asylum near Chester. 10 days later, on October 15th, 1897, he was dead. The post-mortem revealed an effusion of blood on the brain, likely caused by his fall aboard the ship. There was little reason to suspect foul play, but accusations of neglect were harder to dismiss. When he died, Edward Langtry had precisely 11.5 pence to his name. By cruel contrast, just days earlier, Lillie had won a considerable sum when her horse Merman triumphed in the Cesarewitch. And it was she, after all, who had once married Edward for his wealth. Sensing the public's growing ire, Lillie moved swiftly. George Lewis issued a statement. Mrs. Langtry states that, since her separation from her husband many years ago, she has regularly provided him with an adequate allowance. As soon as she learned of his condition, she immediately forwarded money for his immediate needs. This allowance was in addition to his income from Irish property. Notably, she referred to a separation, never a divorce. There was no need to stir that pot any further. Edward Langtry was buried in the Chester Cemetery, his funeral attended by a great crowd eager for a glimpse of his famous former wife. She did not appear. Instead, she sent a wreath of lilies of the valley, tied with a conventional purple ribbon, not, as some claimed, in her racing colors of fawn and blue. The card said simply, "In remembrance, Lillie Langtry." It was a farewell both distant and intimate, an epitaph that said everything and nothing at all. The Daily News, writing of his funeral, offered its own assessment. In an evil hour, he was caught in the whirlwind of London fashion, and being anything but a swimmer and having no artificial supports in fortune, he was quickly on his way to ruin. Those who remember him years ago, a gentleman-like nobody, with a genial, confiding manner that seemed to mark him one of the crew of the Good Intent, can but lament his miserable end. 2 decades earlier, Edward Langtry had watched his wife drop her first curtsy to the Prince of Wales at a grand supper party. How directly had that fateful meeting led to his lonely, penniless death in the Chester Asylum? And do you think Lillie had anything to do with his untimely demise? By 1899, Hugo de Bathe had asked Lillie to be his wife on July 27th of that year in a quiet private ceremony at St. Saviour's Church in Jersey, the very church where she had wed Edward Langtry 25 years earlier. Lillie Langtry, now 46, married 28-year-old Hugo de Bathe. The only witness besides the officiants was her daughter, Jean Marie, then 18. It was a poignant full-circle moment. Mother and daughter, long separated, together at the altar. Did that day mark a reconciliation between them? Perhaps, in some tentative way. Jean had learned the truth of her parentage a few years earlier, when family friend Margot Asquith had let slip that her mother was not her Aunt Lillie, but in fact Lillie Langtry herself, and that her father was Prince Louie of Battenberg. When Jean Marie questioned Lillie on this, Lillie replied coldly, "Would you rather your father were a penniless Irish drunk?" As the Victorian age gave way to the Edwardian era, Lillie, now Lady de Bathe, began to retreat from the frantic pace of her stage career. But retirement did not come at once. Even in her 50s, she remained a commanding presence on the international stage, embracing vaudeville as the theater world evolved. In 1906, at age 53, she made her vaudeville debut, performing dramatic monologues and sketches that suited an actress of undimmed charisma. Audiences still flocked to see her, drawn by the enduring legend of the Jersey Lillie. She remained ever adaptable, ever inventive. It is said that during this period, she inadvertently gave rise to the now famous red carpet tradition. Annoyed by the dust that clung to her costumes as she moved from her dressing room to the stage, Lillie requested a colored carpet be laid down to protect her gown. The theater obliged, choosing red, and so a symbol of prestige was born. The world was changing. By the 1910s, war consumed Europe, bringing upheaval and transformation to every corner of society. Now in her 60s, Lillie contributed as she could, appearing at charity benefits and lending her name to Red Cross efforts. Her husband, Sir Hugo de Bathe, served as an ambulance driver on the French front lines, while Lillie, living primarily in Monaco for its warm climate and favorable taxes, organized aid for soldiers recovering on the Riviera. Though no longer in the daily spotlight, she remained engaged with world affairs and aligned herself with the movement she had quietly embodied all her life, the fight for women's rights. She had, in her own way, always defied the constraints placed upon her gender, fighting to control her own wealth, refusing to be dictated to by men, and forging a career on her own terms. As suffrage movements swept across Britain, she openly supported the cause. In 1908, she joined the Actresses Franchise League, advocating for women's voting rights alongside luminaries such as Ellen Terry and Sybil Thorndike. Though she was not militant, her stance was firm. "Every woman is entitled to her independence," she declared. "It is her right to ignore the dictates of fashion and dress in a manner most becoming to her own character and personality." In her 70s, Lady de Bathe wrote a spirited essay arguing that equality must extend beyond the vote to personal freedoms, including something as seemingly trivial as clothing choices. The woman who had once stunned London in a simple black dress was now championing a woman's right to live and dress as she pleased. Victorian hypocrisy had met its match in Lillie's lifelong refusal to be constrained. Yet for all her public confidence, there was one loss she could never fully reconcile: her estrangement from Jean. After Jean's marriage in 1902, mother and daughter grew increasingly distant. As one contemporary account put it, they were largely estranged for some years. Jean, ever aware of her place in polite society, sought to avoid association with her mother's infamous past, fearing it might hinder her own acceptance. A misunderstanding at the time of Jean's wedding. Some whispered that Lillie had upstaged the bride, others that long-buried paternity secrets had caused friction, led to an abrupt severance of ties. Jean distanced herself, and Lillie, deeply wounded, found herself powerless to change it. She was disappointed, a friend later recalled. She did not speak of it often, but it weighed on her. Over the years, Jean permitted occasional communication, a formal letter here, a polite acknowledgement there, but a true reconciliation never came. Even when Lillie fell gravely ill in 1929, Jean did not come to her side. Jean lived until 1964, yet mother and daughter remained strangers to the end. In 1919, with World War I over and Britain forever changed, Lillie sold her beloved regal lodge and her English properties. At 66, she settled permanently in Monaco, purchasing a villa she named Millais, French for the Lily, a gentle nod to the moniker that had followed her for a lifetime. There, amid gardens that tumbled toward the Mediterranean, she passed her final decade in relative peace. Sir Hugo spent much of his time elsewhere, dividing his days between the south of France and England. Their encounters were infrequent but cordial, a marriage in name more than companionship. Visitors to the villa found Lillie still gracious, sharp, and lively in conversation, her wit as crisp as ever. She tended her roses, entertained guests with old stories, and, at long last, put her life to paper. Her memoir, published in 1925, was a collection of glittering anecdotes, princes, poets, and painters passing through the pages like ghosts of another time. It was not a tell-all. Lillie remained selective in what she revealed, choosing nostalgia over scandal. In it, she reflected, "I do not regret one moment of my life." It was a fitting sentiment. Lillie Langtry had lived boldly, and now, in her final years, she seemed at peace with all that had come before. In January 1929, Lillie caught a cold that worsened into bronchial pneumonia. Her housekeeper remained by her bedside as she weakened. The once dazzling Jersey Lillie, who had captivated kings and conquered continents, now lay quietly in Monte Carlo, her life gently ebbing away. "I know I am at the end," she said. "I shall never get better." Before dawn on February 12, 1929, at the age of 75, Lillie Langtry died peacefully. Her last request was to be buried in Jersey, in her parents' tomb, returning at last to the island of her birth. Even in death, she was met with drama. A fierce winter blizzard delayed her body's passage across the channel. It was not until February 22, 1929, that she was ferried home, where crowds, undaunted by the cold, braved the gales to pay their respects as she lay overnight in St. Saviour's Church. The next day, Lillie Langtry was laid to rest in the family vault, her grave surrounded by flowers despite the snow. The Jersey Lillie had come home. Even as Britain navigated the turbulence of the 20th century, newspapers made space for appreciations of Lillie Langtry. The Daily Mail hailed her as one of the most famous beauties of the closed century. But in the end, who was Lillie Langtry? She began as a small girl from Jersey, eyes bright with dreams of silk dresses, glittering ballrooms, and distant palaces, longing desperately for a life far beyond her narrow shores. And those dreams, in time, came true. Beyond measure, beyond imagining. But each dream exacted its own silent price. For every fortune won, another quietly vanished. For every lover who whispered promises in the dark, Bertie's royal passion, Prince Louis's reckless devotion, there was another whose whispers haunted her in daylight, like her husband Edward Langtry, alone and broken in an asylum, or Jeanne-Marie, the hidden daughter she quietly sacrificed to preserve the very fame she craved. She dazzled crowds, inspiring poets and painters, yet behind society's glittering veil she remained curiously alone. Beauty fades, applause grows silent, wealth slips inevitably through careless fingers. Lillie Langtry lived long enough to see adoration cool into indifference, to outlast kings, rivals, lovers, and finally, even her own legend. The scandals that once defined her dissolved quietly into memory, until at last the Jersey Lily became simply Lady de Bathe, tending roses under the warm Monaco sun. Perhaps, kneeling in her garden, she finally understood. Life's greatest pleasures are not found in the adulation she chased, nor in beauty destined inevitably to fade, but rather in the quiet fragrance of flowers, the warmth of sunlight on aging skin, the sweetness of ordinary moments spent without regret. We dream, we gain, we lose. Yet in the end, what matters most is not what we have conquered, but what we have left behind. Echoes of laughter, quiet gestures of grace, the whispers of kindness remembered when all else is forgotten. Lillie Langtry's life whispers this truth through time, that perhaps our richest reward lies not in becoming great, but in returning at last to who we truly are. Simpler, quieter, wiser, and finally at peace, both with ourselves and the world. I hope you've enjoyed this week's story on the Jersey Lily. Let me know your thoughts on her life. Was she a mere courtesan? Was she confined by her time or ahead of it? Her story inspires countless opinions, and I'd love to hear yours. Thank you to everyone for your continued support, and let me know who you would like to see us cover next. And now, special thanks to the mythic women and men who make this channel possible. Our patrons, our champions, our heroes. Velocity Girl, ZenLife68, Jillian Barker, Junie Moon, Kimberly Ray, Philip Gallegos, Kingsley Clark, Kafum Chung, Harry Thurston, Anna Livy, Michelle Lynn Neal, Karen Craig, Bavia Andrea, Tracy Walsh, Joy McGuire, Elizabeth, CTS Bathory, America Marie, Amber Perry, Amanda Lynn, Snowball, The Inappropriate Heifer, Kendra McNally, Marianne Nelson, Deborah Shepard, Ida Kloster Jensen, Kay Philomeny, Jules Mack, Maureen Tommen, Black Knight 5897, Sammy Lott, Karen Possible, Joanne Thomas Yakato, Deborah Chmielewski, Steve Weinstein, Joya Supreme, Laura Lamond, Beverly Cox Thompson, DDH, Beth Dawson, Stephanie Warren Smith, Sue Whitaker, PB, Monica, Krista Schaefer Hazlett, Marcy Joe, Wendy Fairful, and Trudy DeSwart, and all of you who've supported these stories along the way. If I mispronounced your name or missed it altogether, please send me a message and you'll get a special shout out in the next video. And to everyone watching to the end as the last notes on the video play, remember, stay fearless, keep sharing these stories, and keep sharing your mind, because together we can change history. Until next time, thank you for watching Mythic Women.